Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for logging in for yet another weekly PHO teaching meetings. Today, we have I think, the credit goes to Neeta because she has brought, a great expert, doyen in the field to be talking to us, and a most relevant and a common topic, that is flow cytometry. The timing is also very apt because we all know that some of our colleagues, the FNB exams are going to be held in the next few weeks, and flow cytometry is going to be one of the important topics to be asked in the exams as well, in the exams. So I think in that context also the timing of this session is very, very apt. So I'll take the liberty and privilege of introducing my friend Dr. Anil Handu. We have been friends for a long time now, and he presently is a senior director of lab medicine for the Max group of hospitals, and is based in BLK hospital in Delhi. He was previously associated with Sir Gangaram Hospital and Medanta. He has tremendous experience in the field of lab hematology and flow cytometry. He has been trained in flow cytometry at King's London, as well as in the Westmead Hospital in Westmead, where we kind of spent some time together. Dr. Andu, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and spending this afternoon with us. I'm sure that this session is going to be very relevant and very important for not only for the students but also for the senior faculty and the consultants likewise. And I see a lot of senior colleagues also logged in today to listen to you. So over to you, Dr. Handu, for the next 1.5 hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sunil. It really is a privilege to be introduced by you. I'm kind of having a deja vu for the simple fact that we spent some time together in Australia, and you were such a big support there for me when I needed it the most, especially when I was going through my training for flow cytometry, especially in the areas of MRD. And thanks to Neeta and as well, because she was again instrumental, as you rightly said, in getting me on board today. And fortunately, I've been blessed to have been working with both of you previously in Gangaram, and till times make us meet again, and we work together hopefully at some point of time in life. Anyway, so the topic that I've been assigned today is to talk about flow cytometric immunophenotyping, and I'm going to give you basic principles and applications in leukemia. Since this is primarily a pediatric kind of a conference which I'm looking at, so I will not be really getting into the chronic lymphoproliferative disorders, when we talk about applications in leukemia. But I will surely be talking in detail about acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which happens to be one of the important ones where we need to talk about. And I'll also talk about a little bit of other applications with respect to leukemias by flow cytometry. This is the place where I work in Delhi, BL Kapoor Hospital. It's there in my background as well. And I bring you warm regards from my department here. And just to give you an outline, what I have divided my talk into is to give you a brief introduction about flow cytometry, some of its history, the components of a flow cytometer that we use. We'll talk about analysis by looking at gating strategy, especially the use of CD45 and Y45 becomes an important marker in leukemia phenotyping. We'll talk a little bit about normal phenotype of hematopoietic cells, which is extremely important because unless you know what is normal, you will not be able to talk about what is abnormal. And we'll talk about analysis of leukemia per se, and this I have specifically kept case-based because rather than giving a typical didactic lecture on how we go about it, it is better to see the cases and then take an impression from how we interpret them. And I'll be touching upon mainly ALL, a little bit of AML as well. I'll give you a little bit of application inputs with respect to leukemia MRD and DNA ploidy, which has come up in a big way on the flow cytometry part of it. A little bit about PNH, maybe 1 or 2 slides, and take home message at the end of it. All right. So what is flow cytometry? So if we look at flow cytometry as a science, there are 3 words in it. One is flow, cyto, and metry. And flow is basically nothing but cells have to be in motion or in a flow or in a stream. And it's the cells that you're measuring, and you're measuring them in all aspects, whether it is with respect to their physical properties or the properties within them. And thus flow cytometry is an automated measurement of physical, chemical, and other properties of individual cells or particles which are flowing in a single stream in a fluidic system. Now, if we look at the historical aspects of flow cytometry, what we would realize is that in flow cytometry, we the concept existed for more than almost 7 to 8 decades now. In fact, the earliest flow cytometry descriptions have come about in 1970s, and in clinical laboratories, it started coming up somewhere in the 1980s, especially because of the epidemic of the AIDS, where it became important for us to count the CD4 positive T cells. This is how one of the first flow cytometers looked like. And sorry for the kind of messy picture that you're looking at it here, but just look at the number of instruments which were lying over there, the batteries and the other instruments which were there. And this was the instrument which was first looked at by Wallace Coulter, the one of Coulter fame. And this was based on impedance primarily at that point of time. Eventually, signal processing, etc., was gotten into the picture. And once all that came into picture, even then, at that point of time, if you look at the instrument, it used to occupy almost big size rooms, two big size rooms. And in such a case, the laser also, when it came into the picture subsequently, we needed to make sure that we are taking into the account the fact that we have to keep the laser cooler. So to make it sure that it's kept cool, you needed to have a bigger room and a bigger, clearing areas. And that's how flow cytometry was at that point of time. Till we came to the modern day or the present day flow cytometers, which are just like benchtop models, along with that beautiful, the computer systems and the softwares which are able to give us analysis at a very simple methodology that we adopt in our practice. Now, if you look at flow cytometers, which have been there in existence, I started my journey with a flow cytometer, which is this one. That's the BD Fax Caliber. It was a three color single laser instrument. I also used the Beckman Coulter FC500, which was a single laser, but would interestingly give 5 color experiments done. I also happened to use Navios, which was an instrument used at Westmead Hospital, Australia. And of course, you have this ARIA over here, which is also used as a sorter. So you have so many of these instruments which have been there in the picture, and a lot of them have actually evolved and become bigger and better. And in fact, some of them have even turned smaller. So if you look at this instrument out here, which previously used to be called Accuray C6, now has been taken over by BD. It's virtually a small little benchtop instrument, which is a 4 color instrument, and you can carry this across anywhere across the globe in a small little suitcase. So now if we look at the flow cytometry with respect to its components, there are three important components which we need to remember. We need to have a fluid system because the cells need to be in a fluid state. They have to flow. And then you need to have an optical system which needs to have the laser light, which will fall on the cells, and they'll get interrogated in the flow cell. And then eventually whatever signals will come out and they will get into these photomultiplier tubes and diodes, they will have to be accumulated into the computer system and eventually made available to us on a computer-based graphic system where we are able to interpret them in terms of positivity and negativity and then come to a proper conclusion. Now, a typical flow cytometer, the one which we also have in our lab today, this is from my laboratory itself. You're seeing these pictures. So this is a typical flow cytometer. This is the area where actually the entire interrogation takes place, the one which I'm highlighting here. Of course, these are the computer systems attached to it, which help us to decipher the information coming in from here. And as you see very clearly, these are the laser systems which are there. And then you have these photomultiplier tubes, which are put in a figure-of-8 configuration, which eventually gives you the information. If we look at the fluidics part of it, this is the area from where you push the sample in, and the sample is then sucked into the system, into the flow cell. And of course, you have these lasers, which are then interrogating the cell and giving you the information. Just to show you again, this is a picture here, and this is the interrogation point or the flow cell. You can see this light coming in. These are laser lights, which you're seeing coming in from here. And then this laser light is then eventually captured by rest of the photomultiplier tubes and the diodes, which gets into the electronic systems of the computers to give us the information. So if I put it very simply, what happens is you have a sample tube, which is pushed into the area to suck the sample out. It is pressurized, and with the pressure, the sample is sucked into the sample aspiration tube. It goes into an area which is called a flow cell. Within the flow cell, you also have the sheath fluid coming from the other side, making a fluid and fluid concept just to make sure that the cells fall in a single line for the sensing region to actually interrogate single cell at any given point of time. So if we look at how the principles of flow cytometry work, you have a laser source, a laser light source, which strikes the cell and interrogates the cell. Depending upon the light which is transmitted directly straight ahead, you get what is called the forward scatter, and forward scatter basically measures the size of the cell. And the cell and the light which is actually diffracted, refracted and reflected at right angles to the forward scatter is determines the complexity of the cell, and that is also gathered by various photomultiplier tubes and looked at eventually. Now, we also have a possibility of looking at the cell at various levels. For instance, if you look at the cell on the membrane, there will be these antigens on the membrane which can be looked at, because we have the possibility of looking at it by use of these monoclonal antibodies, these inverted Y-shaped structures which we have made here. And they are tagged with the star thing. The star is actually nothing but a fluorochrome, because that is the fluorochrome which will be actually identified by the laser. And what we do is we tag these cells with the help of these fluorescent labeled antibodies, which are tagged to these antigens on the cell. And once the laser comes in, uh, once the laser is coming in, the laser light falls on it. It excites these fluorochromes to the next higher level. And after exciting it to the next higher level, we know that it has to come back to the basal level. As it comes back to the basal level, it gets excited and emits a different fluorescence, which is then captured by these photoelectric photodiodes or photomultiplier tubes. Now, this is a very typical kind of a assembly of a typical flow cytometer. And in a typical flow cytometer, you need to have a flow cell, which ensures that the cells fall in a single straight line by use of hydrodynamic focusing, which I told you previously as well. You should have a laser. Of course, the number of lasers will determine the number of colors that you can potentially have in a flow cytometer. Most of the flow cytometers that we use today are minimum 2 laser, and a lot of them are 3 laser or 5 laser, depending upon the utility that you have in your laboratory. And of course, you have a photodiode which picks up the forward scatter, and all the side scatter which is coming out is picked up by these photomultiplier tubes. What you're seeing in between are these mirrors and filters. The mirrors and filters help you to ensure that the lights of specific wavelength are passed further, whereas the others which need to be diverted to an area from where we pick it up, those are what is called the filters and the mirrors. So, and in between you also have these lenses which make sure that the light passes specifically to that particular photomultiplier tube. Now, what do you mean by the concept of sheath fluid, and why do we need to have hydrodynamic focusing? I'm sure all of us would agree to the fact that cells, unfortunately, are liable to be destroyed. The moment you take the cell out, it is not stable for more than, maybe about 3 to 4 hours if kept at room temperature, and for more than 24 to 72 hours if kept in a refrigerator at 2 to 8 degrees centigrade. So therefore, these cells, the moment you make them pass in a flow cell at such high pressure, are liable to get destroyed. Now, how do we make sure that they fall in a single straight line? What we do is we use what is called sheath fluid. So the concept is a fluid in fluid concept. The green one that you're seeing here is the sample or the cell, is the cell in the sample. And the yellow fluid, the yellow thing around it is the sheath fluid. And this makes sure that the cells fall in a very single straight line and are able to be detected by the laser. And that's what the concept is called hydrodynamic focusing. Hydro meaning liquid, and dynamic because it's happening as the flow is happening around, and you're focusing the cells by making sure that the cell falls in a single straight line. You also have these lenses which are there in the flow cytometer. The idea of having a lens in a flow cytometer is to make sure that the laser light falls to the specific area that we're targeting. I'll not get into jargons because that will make it boring. I will only try to tell you that the moment you have these optical filters which are there, some light will go to a specific detector. Like for instance, this blue light has gone to the detector over here, whereas the yellow light has started to go ahead and eventually has ensured that the green light comes into the green detector and the yellow light moves to the yellow detector, while the rest of the blue light is eventually going to the rest of the detector. So this is the way we ensure that using filters and the mirrors will ensure that the light reaches the right area within the flow cytometer. Now, why do we need a photomultiplier tube? We must remember that the moment the signal comes out of the cell, the signal is not so strong to ensure that we are able to pick it up and put it into an electronic mode. So for that, we have developed this. We have these available, these you know, devices which are called photomultiplier tubes, in which the original signal gets multiplied and amplified. As you can see in this slide, the original signal was very feeble, and by the time you actually picked it up, it was a very significant signal that you were able to have in front of you, and then you could analyze the signal on a electronic means. Now, if you look at the cell, the moment we are going to be interrogating a cell on a flow cytometer, these are all the things that can potentially be interrogated, as I told you previously. You have the membrane of the cell. You can look at the membrane of the cell with respect to various antigens which are on it. You can look within the cytoplasm of the cell. You can, even within the cytoplasm, these granules, mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, etc., whatever will be within the cell can also be identified, including the enzymes. And that's why you're able to do those lots of assays like DHR assay, etc., which you do on flow cytometry. You can also target the antigens on the membrane and identify them by using a flow cytometer. And you can even enter within the nucleus and look at the genetic material which is present within the nucleus of the cell. So therefore, all these areas are possible to be interrogated by a flow cytometer. Now, what do you mean by forward light scatter? When the simplest way is that if you put a laser light and you put something in between, obviously it's going to obstruct the fall of the light in that area. Depending upon the size, as you see in the top one here, it is a larger particle, whereas the one which is down here is a smaller particle. So depending upon the shadow, in a very colloquial language, depending upon the shadow which is made on the side, you are actually able to detect the size of this particular cells. Of course, this is not an accurate size, but it gives you a rough measurement of the size of the cell. So the cell down here is smaller, whereas the one which is on the top is a larger cell. Now let's look at the side scatter or the complexity, which I was telling you earlier as well. The light scatter which has come out from the laser and gone onto the cell, depending upon the complexity within the cell here is a far more complex cell, and obviously the light which is coming out of it gets diffracted in a very different ways in different directions. Also, a lot of light can get absorbed, and then an eventual light which is coming out of it will be different. And therefore, the complexity picked up by these photomultiplier tubes would be different. Compared to the cell which is down here, this is a less complex cell, and obviously the diffracted light is also relatively less complex. Now, monoclonal antibodies have changed our life a lot with respect to flow cytometry, because if you would look at only the light part of it, which I showed you here, versus the moment you're going to be using these monoclonal antibodies tagged to a fluorochrome, you are actually able to pick up a lot of information from these cells, which I was showing you in one of my previous slides as well. Now, most of the antibodies have been produced from hybridoma clones, and most of the antibodies that we're using today are a monoclonal antibody. That means it's coming from a single clone of cell and is able to give you a specific antigen which is present either on the surface of the cell or within the cytoplasm of the cell or within the nucleus of the cell. And all these are possible to be identified because these antibodies are actually labeled with a fluorescent dye. Now, you must have heard about 2-color flow cytometry, single color flow cytometry, multicolor flow cytometry, 10 color, 14 color, and things like that, because that's something which a lot of people discuss and talk about. What we need to remember is when we talk about a single color versus a multicolor flow cytometry, we are only talking about the fluorochromes that we're using within a flow cytometry stage system. So when we use a single fluorochrome, we are going to get only a single color histogram. So anything which is out here is positive for that single color, whereas the one which is out here is completely negative, and in between this particular peak is giving you positivity, which is variable. Similarly, this is a different color, again in a different fluorochrome. So again, when you're using a single fluorochrome on a cell, you're doing a single color flow cytometry. When you look at 2-color pattern, in a 2-color pattern, you will have this typical quadrant kind of a system, which a lot of people will still follow. However, most of the people across the globe have now given up the concept of quadrants because they believe that even this particular cell might be showing slight positivity for a fluorochrome which is on this channel. Anyway, now we will not get into details of that, but we'll just remember one very simple thing is that when you do a 2-color pattern, you can put them across with each other and identify presence of cells which are co-expressing those 2 fluorochromes, like the one which is present in this particular quadrant here, and similarly over here as well. There is also one very important aspect to remember, and that is viability testing. Viability testing conventionally in a laboratory is being done by using trypan blue testing. I'm not trying to say that that's not a good test, but it is not a very sensitive test. So to identify whether the cells are dead or alive is extremely important in flow cytometry, because these dead cells have a tendency to attract an antibody and bind it to its surface, giving you a false positivity with respect to that particular antibody. So therefore, in a viability testing, it's very important to remember that whenever you do flow cytometry, your viability should be at least about 85 to 90% for giving you the right results. This becomes extremely important when you're dealing with, MRD analysis. And in all MRD analysis, you wouldn't want dead cells to be interfering in your detection of cells. For instance, if you look at this particular population, where we were looking for the kappa and the lambda light chain restriction, if you would have looked at these cells, which are actually dead, you would have assumed that you have a double positive kappa and lambda, which is wrong. Instead, the moment you used a viability dye, you were able to get hold of the dead cells out of it, because the viability dye helps you to make sure that they are taken out of estimation. So all this blue population over here went away, and only this population remained, which eventually you found out that they were only positive for lambda, telling you very clearly that you're dealing with a clonal population of viable B cells. As I told you, cell marker studies are very, very important type of studies which can be done on a flow cytometer, and that's what is exploited by in a flow cytometer, and you are using it for leukemia diagnosis. So in all these possibilities, as I told you, membrane antigens can be looked at, cytoplasmic constituents can be looked at, you can look at nuclear components, DNA studies, of course, cellular uptake mechanisms which are used in the chronic granulomatous disease, etc. And the samples that can potentially be used for doing flow cytometry usually, of course, are the peripheral blood and the bone marrow, but you can also use lymph nodes, you can use tumor tissues from the body, you can use body fluids, you can use material from which is archived, even that can be used for DNA ploidy studies. So there's one important aspect which we need to remember. The moment we do leukemia analysis, there is one aspect which a lot of people forget, and that's about setting up of the threshold in an instrument. Now, if we look at this particular plot here, these three populations which you're seeing here on a forward and the side scatter are lymphocytes, monocytes, and granulocytes. And if you've not set up the threshold appropriately on a flow cytometer, you will actually be creating a problem for yourself in a situation like this, where you've lost a lot of cells because you have not ensured that the debris has been excluded appropriately, and then you are also excluding a lot of cells within the analysis. So when you are interpreting setting up of thresholds, and setting up of the instrument again becomes extremely important. Again, I won't want to get into details of this because of the jargons that it has, but we must remember that data display can be done using a lots of software. You do not necessarily need to have the same software available with you, because all the flow cytometry data today is available on what is called a standard file format, which is the flow cytometry standard format, FCS file. And this FCS file can potentially be sent across on an email to any of the experts across the globe, who can then eventually analyze them using a software. And these softwares, a lot of them are free also online, and some of them are paid. And these softwares are standalone softwares which can be available with the expert, and he can analyze your data there. Just like you have a block for a tissue pathology, you have FCS file for flow cytometry. And importantly, as I told you previously also, the data which you are looking at on the flow cytometer can be looked at in three different ways. In fact, many different ways, but the most common three different ways that are used is one which is more like a single histogram plot, or you can have a two-dimensional plot where you have two dimension on two different axes. Like here, you have a CD45 expression on the x-axis, whereas side scatter is looked at the y-axis. And you can also have three-dimensional expression wherein you can rotate the cube kind of a structure over here and identify various small tiny cell populations. And this becomes important when you're trying to look for tiny populations in minimal residual disease detection. How do you get this data on a scatter plot? Remember, every data point that you get on a scatter plot, which you're seeing over here, actually is assigned a number. So that's why everything becomes numerical, and everything becomes quantitative in flow cytometry. Even though I may still be generating a qualitative report and saying that whether it's positive or negative for it, I can actually tell you how many dots are coming positive in that particular area. As you can see in this particular area, the file is called a list mode data file. And in this list mode data file, you have all these data points which are coming in. And these data points are actually assigned a specific number. And this is always reproducible. And that's why the FCS format becomes extremely important for any flow cytometry person dealing with a usual flow cytometry plot. This leads me to the next part of the talk, which is the flow cytometry analysis and interpretation. And when we are doing clinical application of flow cytometry, you must remember in a typical leukemia lymphoma phenotyping, you can use flow cytometry. Of course, you can use it for minimal residual disease detection. You can do DNA ploidy studies, which are extremely important in flow cytometry when you're dealing with leukemias. You can also look at drug efflux assays, which can be done for based on flow cytometry for leukemia analysis. Of course, we have also known that absolute counting on flow cytometry is possible, including the dendritic cell and leukemia cell sorting. Now, if we look at leukemia evaluation today, it has really evolved over the last so many years. And most importantly, if we look at 2000, the era 2000 now, this is where we stand. We are expected to do flow cytometry. We're expected to do molecular cytogenetics, cytochemistry, everything possible on the surface of the earth to ensure that we categorize the leukemias appropriately and tailor therapy accordingly eventually. Now, when we look at classification and diagnosis of leukemias, immunophenotyping, as you can see at point number 2 here, becomes a very important aspect because it takes less than a day to get all your results done. And most of the times it's extremely relevant in all acute leukemias. Of course, it has a role to play in CLL, CML, and other disorders as well. But in a pediatric population, AL and AML happen to be a few very important aspects where flow cytometry is done. And the costs involved in flow cytometry can vary anywhere between 3,000 to 15,000 in a private sector. And of course, in government sector, it is free as well. These are various representations of data, which you can see in flow cytometry. I told you that there is something called a dot plot and a histogram and a three-dimensional plot. Other than that, you can also see contour plots, which are over here, and you can see box display of statistics. You can also have variable expressions vis-a-vis the density populations, and eventually, more than 3 dimensions can also be looked at. I will not be getting into details of all those various representations, but we will primarily focus on dot plots in our analysis subsequently. Now, when we do analysis in flow cytometry, the first and the most important step in immunophenotypic analysis is gating. And it is very important aspect. Remember, gating is something which you can do in even after getting the data on a flow cytometer. You do not need to gate prior, but pre-gating or live gating is preferred whenever you are trying to look for minimal cell populations, or you are doing cell enumerations like for stem cell enumeration. So what is a gate? It is a numerical or a graphical boundary that can be used to define characteristics of a particle to include for further analysis. And I'll just be explaining a little bit in my subsequent slides as to what it talks about. So if we look at gating, what happens is, this is a typical scatter plot which you get when you are running your white cells in a flow cytometer from a peripheral blood sample. You get 3 distinct populations of cells, even though they seem to be colored differently here. But normally we are not so fortunate to get such distinct, colors. They are all overlapping and come over one another. However, you can clearly and distinctly see that they are forming dense, kind of structures on a dot plot. Now, I told you forward scatter means the size of the cell. So that means any cell which is in this region on the y-axis has to be the smallest cell. And the smallest cell on a flow cytometry and even morphologically is the lymphocyte. It's also the least complex. So therefore, the side scatter is also very low on this axis or the x-axis. Now compare this to this population over here, which has definitely a higher forward scatter, and it also has relatively more side scatter. And this is a population which is representing the monocytes. Come to this last population, or the red population over here, it has got a relatively much higher forward scatter compared to what you saw on the lymphocytes, but on a side scatter, it has got a very, very high side scatter. So if you look at all the 3 populations now, these are your lymphocytes because they have the lowest forward and the side scatter. These are your monocytes and these are your granulocytes. Now, if I want to analyze them further and see which population is expressing what kind of markers that I have added to the flow cytometry experiment, I will need to put something like this on a software. This encircling, or whichever way I want to put, whether a square, etc., is the population, is actually the methodology, what is called gating. Like for similarly, I have put a gate around these cells, which are granulocytes, and I've put a gate around these monocytes. I can have 3 distinct gates and analyze them separately, or I can combine 2 gates together and say gate on gate kind of a concept. All this is possible to be done on a software. This has nothing to do with the acquisition of the cells, because acquiring the cells into the flow cytometer is different and analyzing the cells is different subsequently. Now, just to show you how gating works, if you look at the CD45 and side scatter dot plot over here, and I'll be explaining it in detail subsequently, these cells over here, which have got the highest expression of CD45 and a very low side scatter, are your lymphocytes, and they have been identified as lymphocytes. Now, these lymphocytes have also been identified on a forward and a side scatter, which we saw in our previous slide as well, which are very distinctly here. And out of them, now I want to identify how many are my B cells and how many are my T cells. So I put a gate around it, and then on those gated lymphocytes, when I'm trying to look for the CD3 positive T cells versus CD19 positive B cells, I find 9% of my cells are actually 19 positive only, indicating that these are my B cells. And these are 74% cells over here, which are CD3 positive only, indicating that they are my T cells. And I have these cells which are negative for both 19 and 3. That means they are the cells which are neither B and nor T, they are 17%. So clearly by gating, I have been able to analyze these lymphocytes further. So that's why gating becomes an extremely important and the most crucial aspect of analysis when we are doing leukemia, lymphoma, or any phenotyping for that matter on a flow cytometer. Remember, forward scatter and side scatter happen to be your first plot, which always is looked at in the flow cytometry system. And that is this particular plot, which I was showing you previously, the forward scatter and the side scatter. You have the choice of putting forward scatter on y-axis and side scatter on x-axis, or vice versa, as you may be comfortable with. And then, as I told you, forward scatter will collect the information from the laser beam at 180 degrees, whereas side scatter will collect it at 90 degrees from the thing. Now remember, there is also a concept nowadays of adding what is called a singlet bead. Now singlet plot is a plot where you are trying to remove, no matter when we try to send the cells across a laser, in a flow cytometer, we expect that the cells which are passing through are a single cell at any given point of time. Many a times they do not follow our norms, and two cells may pass at the same time, and those two cells will produce a much higher forward scatter area, and those cells are otherwise called doublets. So when you use a forward scatter height versus a forward scatter area, these droplets or dots which are present in this area, which are called singlets, are the ones which you want to look at, because doublets will always give you a wrong information. And then once you have looked at the singlet plot, the one which is here, you move on to a plot which is called the forward and the side scatter dot plot. And in that, you are able to identify very clearly three distinct populations: the lymphocytes, the monocytes, and the granulocytes, clearly separately from one another. However, this is not sufficient because it's not able to tell you within the granulocytes which granulocytes are there, and are there any presence of any blasts, because blasts will have a tendency to fall either in the lymphocyte or the monocyte region majority of the times. So it becomes important for us to remember that when we are analyzing basis the forward scatter and the side scatter alone, there is always a probability of we missing out cells. Now, how do we figure out whether we have blast there or do not have blast there? The simplest way to look at it is by looking at CD45 versus side scatter. And this is the plot that I have shown you here, is very clearly, distinctly telling you that there are these cells which are falling in the blast region on 45 side scatter. And if you see the forward scatter, side scatter here, you're able to pick them in this region as well, which is the red population seen in this area. So therefore, it becomes important for us to remember that we need to look at a CD45 side scatter, and I'll be showing that subsequently in my few other slides. So therefore, CD45 side scatter happens to be a very, very important first step when you're trying to distinguish leukemia in on leukemia flow cytometry between blast or no blast. And not only blast or low blast, you will also want to differentiate between whether these are immature cells or mature cells, and on a mature cell, what other further categorization can you potentially get into. Now, this is a very important plot which I have been using for a very, very long time, and it stands published in Indian Pediatrics as well. You can always refer to that. This is a very interesting thing because when you look at 45 versus side scatter, you are able to differentiate between various cell types in a particular individual. So let's look at this from this angle. You have these cells over here which are having the highest expression of CD45. If you go from 0 on the right hand side, you have these cells which are extreme right, and these cells are your lymphocytes. The cells which are lying just on top of it over here are the cells which are having slightly higher side scatter, but they have for the 45 expression slightly dimmer than the lymphocytes, and these are your monocytes. The cells which are in fact having lesser expression of CD45 but relatively higher side scatter are these cells over here, which are relatively complex. And this entire complex which you're seeing here is a composition of all the different granulocytes, which includes the neutrophils, the mature neutrophils, the eosinophils, which have a relatively higher side scatter, and of course the band forms and relatively more immature cells more towards the base of this particular plot. You have cells which are falling in the CD45 negative region over here, and most of the times in a normal bone marrow, they will be having nucleated red cells, dead debris cells, and platelets, etc. will fall in this region. And this whole area within the center area used to be called what is called the blast hole. And this is the area where you will have oleoblasts. So if you see a plot like this and you're seeing cells present in this area, the first impression that you should make in your mind is, can these be blasts? Because there are two other cell populations which can also be present in this region, and those are the dendritic cells as well as basophils. They can also fall in this area. And very rarely, especially in adults, plasma cell leukemias can also fall. Plasma cells can also fall in the same region. So thus, we need to remember this very, very clearly in our mind, that we need to look at CD45 side scatter dot plot to come to a conclusion as to what we are dealing with. Now, when you look at a CD45 side scatter dot plot, these are the plots which you can keep in your mind. It will actually make sure that you remember as to how these plots will give you an indication as to what kind of acute leukemia are you dealing with. So if you see a blasts which are very clearly like the way you're seeing over here, which have a relatively higher side scatter, and these are like having a very definite, clear indication as these are separate from the granulocytes and monocytes. You see this in a classical acute myeloid leukemia pattern. When you have these purplish cells which are passing into the monocyte region, you're more likely dealing with a myelomonocytic leukemia. When you have cells which are falling down here but are forming a teardrop kind of a structure, this is seen in a typical APML pattern. You also have something called CD45 negative pattern, and this can be a pediatric acute lymphoblastic leukemia, especially the leukemias which are usually seen between 2 to 10 years of age. You typically have a classical ALL pattern the way I'm showing you here. It has a very low side scatter comparatively, and it always tries to move into the negative area of the ALL. This is a typical hematogone pattern wherein you have these cells which are actually abutting the lymphocyte region and are forming a small little device like that. This is a chronic lymphoproliferative disorder pattern which is seen in adults, CLPD. And this is a hairy cell leukemia pattern where it forms something like a hat on top of the lymphocytes on a CD45 side scatter. And these are highly reproducible patterns which have been seen across by most of the flow cytometrists across the globe. So you will be able to differentiate between normal and abnormal only if you know what is normal. Now I am showing you 4 slides over here where I am trying to show you the normal maturation patterns of B cells, of T cells, of granulocytes and monocytes. Now this is the maturation pattern of B cells, and if you see the color over here, the red color that you're seeing is it's fading over here and becoming brighter and then fading again. This variation in color tells you the relative expression of these markers in various cell states. So if I look at the most immature cell of the B cell, it is positive for TDT and 34. But as I move towards the maturity part of it, obviously this fades away completely. Similarly, CD10 is seen in early B precursors in normal cases also, and also the follicular center cells. That's why follicular center cell lymphomas are positive for CD10, and color positive BALLs are also positive for CD10. CD38 also happens to be a marker which is seen on plasma cells, very, very bright. The brightest is on plasma cells, but then it's also seen on immature cells of the B or B cell ontogeny. Important aspect to be remembered is 19 is a marker which is a universal marker of identifying T cells. Very clearly you can see it's present all across, and at the plasma cell stage level, even there it's positive, but it's relatively dimmer. You can also have expression of 20, but 20 is usually seen in mature B cells. And of course, kappa and the lambdas are usually seen in late B cells. And of course, on plasma cell surface, it's not positive there. Let's look at the normal T cell maturation. In a normal T cell maturation, similar kind of patterns are seen. TDT is present in the earliest T cell precursors, but look at this. It's not the CD3. If you see CD3 over here and here, which is cytoplasmic and the surface CD3, in early precursors, many a times CD3 may not be expressed at all, but look at 7. 7 is ubiquitously present at all stages, and TDT again becomes relatively important. A point to remember is CD4 and 8 expression on T cells. You can have double positive CD4 and 8 T cells, and you can also have double negative CD4 and 8 cells, which is very characteristic of early precursors of T cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia. When you come to granulocytic maturation, again, various markers which are there. All these markers, preferably one needs to remember. Most important marker is that if you look at 15, in the earlier precursors, it's not expressed, but in the later ones, it's expressed. And of course, the 34 and the other markers. One important aspect that I would like to share with you is the expression of CD10. CD10 is a marker which is usually seen in precursor B acute lymphoblastic leukemias, but keep in mind that it is also expressed by mature neutrophils. So sometimes when you're doing flow cytometry and you're not finding CD10 on neutrophils, question yourself that have you put the CD10 antibody into the tube or not. Monocytic maturation, again, similar kind of expressions which you see on 45 versus 34, etc. But just look at 33. 33 is very, very bright maturation marker of the monocytes. And of course, you have HLA-DR, which is also brightly seen in monocytes. 36, 14, and 16 are other markers which can be looked at, but out of them, 14 is expressed in the most mature monocytic lineage. So therefore, when you're looking at acute leukemia of monocytic lineage, expression of CD14 may not be there. And in fact, if it is there, you should start questioning, are you really dealing with an acute process or not? Now, the other aspect which I wanted to talk to you about is with respect to the concept of dim, moderately bright, and bright flow cytometric expressions. It is dependent upon the fluorescence that is excited by the cells. So if you look at granulocytic expression, the expression of 45 on them is relatively dimmer compared to the lymphocytes, which have a much higher expression of fluorochrome. So here I've used, say, FITC fluorochrome, and depending upon the expression of FITC on the lymphocytes, it very clearly tells me that the lymphocytes are the brightest. Now, what do we mean by the concept of dim and bright when we're looking at the report or the format or the picture or the scatter plot which is coming from a laboratory? For instance, in this particular plot, if you see here, you have two antibodies which have been used. One, it is CD7 and the other one is CD5. There is a population of cell which is falling in this particular area, and there are very, very few cells which are falling in this area and the other two areas which are on top here. Very clearly, most of our cells are negative for both CD7 and CD5. Now, if this population, the red population, would have fallen somewhere here, that means it's very, very bright for CD7. And somewhere in this region, it will be moderately bright, whereas in this region, it is absolutely dim or absent. Similarly, if for 5, we had the population falling in the top quadrant over here on top, then that would mean that it's very bright positive for CD5. So this is important for us to remember because that's how the flow cytometry jargons come in your reports. And at times you can get, kind of confused as to what is positive and what is negative. Now, in my hospital, what we use is a BD Fax Canto as on date, and it is a 3-laser 8-color instrument. That's what we use, and we are planning to upgrade, in fact, in the process of upgrading to a 10-color instrument as on date. Now, when you approach analysis of flow cytometry of acute leukemias, I told you 45 forms the pivotal part of, the estimation, and I already informed you that we have these lymphocytes, the monocytes, and the granulocytes on the top. And of course, we have the blasts, and sometimes we can have also basophils and nucleated red cells. And the same thing is picked up on the forward side scatter analysis as well. Now, for flow cytometric acute leukemia phenotyping, an important aspect is to find accurate diagnosis and classification. We also need to ensure that we have adequate knowledge of prognostic factors. We can do monitoring of the response subsequently, and more importantly, many a times on CNS, estimation of CSF, sometimes we might need help of flow cytometry to define whether we're dealing with blasts or they only lymphocytes. So in diagnosis and classification of leukemias, flow cytometry has a very important role to play in identification of blasts, in enumeration of blasts, and assignment of lineage of the blast. We can also identify abnormal blasts and subclassification of the cells. Now, when you identify blasts, what are the things which you need to keep in mind? They need to have a low side scatter. They need to have a weak or a dim CD45 expression. Remember, in childhood acute lymphoblastic leukemias, the CD45 expression is sometimes absent. And markers of immaturity, if they are present, CD34 and TDT, that actually makes your diagnosis far more comprehensive, and you're very confident about calling it an acute leukemia. And lack of maturation markers again becomes extremely important when you're trying to identify blasts. So this is also important for us to remember. So for instance, in this particular case, you have a very low side scatter and a weak expression of 45. It's almost negative 45 expression. And then when you're looking at the presence of TDT, it's also positive for TDT, these red population, and the population is also positive for CD34. So therefore, when you have expression of 34 TDT and they are lying the way they were lying on CD45, you have identified blasts. Now coming to enumeration of blasts, remember flow cytometry's primary role is never to count the blast. It's not been designed, the experiments have not been designed to count the blasts, but yes, it can still enumerate. However, you must remember that they may not be really correct enumeration. Sometimes it may count it lower than the manual count that you're doing on a morphology, and sometimes you can have a higher count than the manual count, because there are a lot of issues which we need to work with. You may have a diluted sample, you may have 45 expression which may vary, and you may have cells which are not expressing 34 and 117, and in such cases your counts may be lower than the manual counts. However, you may also have a higher count. Sometimes you may not have released, the red cells may not, the nucleated red cells may not have lysed well, and there may be non-specific binding of cells. The density gradient which you use for separation might give you problems, and sometimes it may be due to poor preservation, and I told you about viability, and viability of the sample might be compromised. Now, in a typical flow cytometry laboratory, what are the markers which you should ideally be looking at? These are the markers which are expected. Markers of immaturity, TDT in 34, lineage specific markers, which includes MPO, CD22 in the cytoplasm. A lot of people use cytoplasmic 79A. We prefer to use both. T cells we use especially for the acute leukemias, cytoplasmic CD3 is important. Of course, these are other plethora of markers which one needs to make sure that's available in your repertoire when you're trying to do acute leukemia flow cytometry. Remember, lineage infidelity markers are also important. Like for instance, you have markers which are in AML are not really normally seen and are supposed to be infidel, because like B cell markers or T cell markers, if they're present in AML, they are useful in leukemia-associated immunophenotypes when you do MRD detection. Other than that, other markers which are also important and should be a part of your profile would give you help when you're trying to do minimal residual disease detection later on. Now I'll show you some CD45 side scatter patterns which are seen in acute lymphoblastic leukemias, and this is an experience of over last about 15 years now. Now this is a typical B cell precursor B cell ALL where you're seeing these lymphocytes which are on a CD45 side scatter over here, having the lowest expression of in terms of side scatter and very high expression of CD45. And just abutting it with a very low side scatter are these blasts, which are kind of spread out and moving towards the dim CD45 region. This is a typical characteristic picture which we see in precursor B cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Another case of precursor B cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia in a childhood, you see these lymphocytes which are very characteristically different from where we were seeing earlier. And of course, you have these few granulocytes, residual granulocytes which are there. But then just look at the lymphocytes over here, the blasts over here, which have moved on to the left-hand side and have significantly crossed towards the negative region. And another interesting pattern of CD45 side scatter in a typical childhood ALL, where you have absolutely negative CD45 expression. You can see in this population, these are your lymphocytes and a few residual granulocytes as well. This is another pattern which is again very important, where you see these lymphocytes over here, and you have these populations which are like giving you three distinct populations over here. One significant population over here, which was found to be monocytes eventually. And these are your blasts over here, which are your B lymphoblasts. And of course, another group of lymphoblasts, which was also expressing the B lymphoblastic antigens. You can have expressions and you can have variable expression of 45 the way you're seeing in this particular blast population. Another population of cells which you start from the blast region, but it's kind of overlapping into the monocyte region and has also extended upwards into the granulocyte region. This is again a very typical pattern which you see in acute myelomonocytic leukemias. A teardrop pattern which I showed you earlier, you can see over this over here. It's not really in a typical blast region, just on top of the blast region and expanding upwards into the granulocyte region, forming a typical teardrop pattern. And this is a very characteristic picture which you see in cases of acute promyelocytic leukemia. I showed you this earlier as well. You have these blasts which are getting into the promonocyte and the monocyte region. The way it is going in this characteristic fashion is a picture which is characteristic of a case of acute myelomonocytic leukemias. Now, just a single pattern right in front of you. If you see, all these patterns are possible in precursor B cell acute lymphoblastic leukemias. And one should be wary of the fact that when you see these patterns, you have to decipher and analyze each cell population separately to come to a very correct and a logical conclusion. I'll be showing you some cases with respect to acute lymphoblastic leukemia for us to understand how it really helps. This was a 5-year-old male patient, who had low hemoglobin at 8 grams and had platelets which were low as well at 22,000 and a borderline white cell count of 3,800. The sample which was sent was bone marrow. And this is what we saw. I showed you in one of my pictures earlier as well. You have a characteristic blast population over here, which is falling in CD45 negative region. A lot of people would not even bother to gate this and give you the right perspective of the patient, and therefore it's important for people to remember that you need to gate them. Now, we have put various gates in this particular case. We have gated blue ones, which are your lymphocytes, the monocytes, the granulocytic cells over here, and of course this is what we thought of whether they were blasts. And clearly, when we are seeing on a CD19 and a 10 dot plot, these red cell population which I'm showing you here is positive for both 19 as well as CD10, clearly indicating you're dealing with something which is a B cell malignancy. You also have expression of 14, which is negative. There are some erythroid cells in the same area, which is okay, which can happen, but you do not have any other expression in them. So your CD9 and 10 was positive. You have some minimal expression of 13, minimal expression of 15. Your HLA-DR is very, very strongly positive here, and you have CD34 positivity. So basis this, a diagnosis of precursor B cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia has been entertained in this particular patient. Going to case number 2, this was a 1-year-old female, low hemoglobin at 8.9, low platelets, and count which is relatively on a higher side. A peripheral blood sample had been sent for flow cytometry. Again, you have these lymphocytes over here, which are the black ones, but you still have these significant amount of blasts which are falling and having a very, very low side scatter. If you look at them on the plots with the other markers which are there, they are negative for CD10, which is very, very important to remember because it's an infant ALL that you're seeing. You have HLA-DR positivity. You have a significant expression of CD15, and you have no expression of 10 or a very minimal expression of 10. 38 is very bright, again, clearly indicating that you're dealing with blasts, and no other expression of myeloid markers or any other markers of monocytic lineage, no marker of T cell lineage, which is expressed on these cells, no 5, no 2, very, very minimal 117 and no 14. So when you have an expression the way we saw, and you do not have any MPO expression, and 79 is pretty bright, we are dealing with a patient who has got a CD10 negative precursor B cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And this patient also had positivity for CD15, clearly indicating that you might be dealing with MLL gene rearrangement. Next case is a 55-year-old female. It's a peripheral blood sample which was sent. The hemoglobin was near normal. You had platelets which were reduced with a leukocytosis. And in this particular case, you had this particular sample having the expression of these lymphoid cells, which were kind of getting abutted next to it, but the side scatter was slightly on a higher side. And when you look at 20, the 20 was very bright in this particular patient. You also had 19 and 10 expression, but you had significant expression of 34. Otherwise, presence of this 20 would have made us believe that we are probably dealing with a lymphoma. And therefore, and HLA-DR was also positive. All the other markers, which includes myeloid markers, the T lymphoid markers, are all negative, and you had expression of CD79A and TTT as well. So with these kind of expressions, it is a CD20 positive precursor B cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Of course, becomes very important because in such cases, you would use CD20 as a marker for your minimal residual disease detection. I come to the next case, which is a 4-month-old child. He had hepatosplenomegaly and pallor with severe thrombocytopenia. It was having 10 grams of hemoglobin. The white cell count was normal. We didn't find any significant blasts in the peripheral blood at all, but we found platelets were low. Now, in this particular patient, this is how the bone marrow panned out. In the bone marrow, we were able to see the lymphocytes, which is over here that I'm pointing out. And we are seeing these cells just next to it, abutting to it and forming like a trail, like a duck, 3 ducks in a row or something. And these are contour plots, which are very clearly telling me, yes, you have some populations over here, which are kind of overlapping between each other. This kind of a pattern is very typical pattern of hematogone hyperplasia. Now, in this particular case, again, a density plot, you can see hematogones, a lot of B cells, which are there in this patient. And these two plots become very important. The plot over here, which is between 45 and 10, you have this characteristic expression of 45 and 10, the double egg pattern. And then you also have this inverted J pattern or the waterfall pattern, which is seen in a characteristic case of hematogone hyperplasia. You have no other expressions of other markers. And you also have the T cells, which are absolutely normal. The 400 ratio is very well maintained. And eventually, when you do the kappa and the lambda, you have polyclonal B cells as well in the entire workup of this particular patient. And this was nothing but a case of hematogone hyperplasia. The patient actually had like glycogen storage disorder, which was subsequently diagnosed by genetic analysis. The next case is a 10-year-old male with a big jaw swelling. I'm sure by looking at this and the picture just next to it, which is a starry sky appearance, you would have made your diagnosis. So no prizes for it, but just to show you that this is how the morphology, the flow cytometry looked like. It had a very bright 19 and 20 expression. The cells were also positive for CD10. There was no expression of CD5, 4 and 8 was normal, and the cells were restricted to lambda light chain, clearly indicating that you were dealing with something which was a B cell, mature B cell malignancy. And the expression of IgM was very, very bright in this particular case. And the S phase fraction, which I was telling to you earlier, was pretty high at almost 30.2% compared to a case where the S phase fraction was pretty low. Now, this is a typical case of Burkitt's lymphoma in leukemic phase, and that's what we picked up in this particular patient. The next case is a 12-year-old male. His complete blood count showed a slightly lower hemoglobin. Platelets were near normal and a leukocytosis was there. And this is how the chest X-ray was there. I'm sure you would have understood what I'm trying to show you. You have a widening of the mediastinum over here, and this is an age-matched chest X-ray of another patient. So widening of mediastinum is very, very obvious. Obviously, you would have understood that I'm trying to tell you that we're dealing with something which is a T-cell malignancy. So we found that the cytoplasmic CD3 was very nicely positive, but the surface CD3 was negative in this case, and CD5 was minimally expressed in this case. We found that the 8 expression was minimal, 7 was positive. It was a TCR gamma delta positive case, and eventually the patient was found to be a TCR gamma delta positive T cell lymphoma. All right, let's look at a few cases of acute myeloid leukemia as well. For all practical purposes, myeloid leukemias are diagnosed primarily basis on flow cytometry and molecular techniques. And of course, cytogenetics plays an important role. But there are 3 very important acute myeloid leukemias which one needs to keep in mind. One is acute myeloid leukemia M0, in which morphology may not be really very helpful. And in all such cases, you would like to know whether you're dealing with myeloid or lymphoid. And most of the times these will be positive for 13 and also expressing 117. You had other myeloid markers. Many a times your myeloperoxidase expression may not be there even on immunophenotype, and it becomes a bit of a challenge at that point of time. And you are expected to put a CD7 as well. This is one entity where one needs to be very cautious because expression of MPO needs to be demonstrated either by flow cytometry, like in this case, you're not seeing expression of MPO. You have the controls of granulocytes there, but you were able to pick up the MPO on cytochemistry. So cytochemistry has not lost its role even till date. The other group of leukemias which can potentially give you a problem on immunophenotyping is the myelomonocytic leukemias or the monocytic leukemias, the M5As and the M5Bs, which were previously called so. And if you look at this is a red cell population of the population which is important for monocytic differentiation. You can figure it out that it's showing 11B expression and 64 expression. It's also expressing some DIM13 and some CD4 expression, and this CD4 expression is typical of monocytic expression. You need to do a non-specific esterase, which was positive in this particular case, and basis that, the patient was classified as acute monocytic leukemia M5A. In M5B, in addition to all that I just told you, you can also have expression of CD14, and that is what one needs to keep in mind, that you can have M5B, which is more of a mature monocytic malignancy. Coming to M7, the M7 acute lymphoblastic leukemia is another leukemia which can resemble, an ALL, and therefore, in such cases, it's important for us to, pick it out on flow cytometry. You use the platelet markers 41 and 61. Remember, these 41 and 61 as a marker in M7 would be preferably used in cytoplasm because surface expression of these can happen when you have platelets adherent onto the blast, which happens pretty often during flow cytometry. So AML M7 diagnosis is again basis flow cytometry. Now, biphenotypic leukemia or mixed lineage leukemia is a group of disorders which is really baffling, because it's really evolved over a lot of over a period of time. We used to have an Eagle scoring system previously, which I personally thought was not bad, but then we have come back to a state where we are looking at myeloid lineage using myeloperoxidase. And mind you, it needs to be proven either on flow cytometry, immunohistochemistry, or cytochemistry. So you cannot really say that MPO negative on flow cytometry, it's not having a myeloid lineage unless you have done IHC or cytochemistry. Again, for monocytic differentiation, at least two of the following, that means the non-specific esterase, CD11C, 14, 64, or lysozyme, any of the two out of them, if they are positive, monocytic differentiation needs to be considered. Similarly, for T, we need to have 3 as an important marker that needs to be looked at. And for B, we need to have either a strong 19 with the other markers, which may be relatively less strong, or a weak 19 with at least strong expression of all these markers. So all these have been given to us from the WHO now, and most of us are following the same practices. Just to show you one odd case of bilineal and biphenotypic leukemias, what you're obviously seeing here is a case which is expressing both 3 intracytoplasmic as well as myeloperoxidase intracytoplasmic, clearly indicating that you're dealing with a T myeloid malignancy. And of course, you can also have bilineal leukemias wherein there can be 2 distinct lineages, one which is, you know, a myeloid lineage significantly present in that particular aspect, and the other lineage which may not be a myeloid lineage, which may be a lymphoid lineage. So you may have 2 distinct ones. Coming to use of flow cytometry in leukemia MRD analysis, the minimal residual disease is a term which is used, for immunophenotypic, molecular, or cytogenic genetic evidence of leukemic cells which are present in the bone marrow, but on routine microscopic examination by morphology, you're not able to pick it up. And this is what has become kind of norm of today for majority of the myeloid leukemias, lymphoid leukemias. And it's important to remember that many a times presence of hematogones can actually give you a lot of complication while you're deciphering between the blasts and the cells during that point of time. So important aspects to remember is that we need to know what is the maturational pattern of hematogones. I showed you one of the cases previously. I'll not get into details of that, but just to show you one of the cases where you can have various stages of hematogones. And this is how the hematogone proliferation takes place. And these boxes which you're trying to see over here are the usual patterns which you see in a typical hematogone hyperplasia in a marrow. Just to show you a case of diagnostic marrow versus a minimal residual disease marrow, this is a case where we had a case having a CD38 expression, which was relatively dimmer. And you also had expression of bright CD10 along with 19. And see, very characteristically, they're falling out of these small little boxes or out of the white spaces that we're talking about. And these are the populations eventually which are picked up on flow cytometry subsequently at day 29 or day 28 marrows. Another case of leukemia, where you're seeing this particular population over here and how it has panned out at the minimal residual disease detection later. There are some areas where it is difficult to figure out whether they are falling in the, the hematogone area or the leukemic area, but there are other patterns which will clearly help you distinguish and differentiate between various subtypes. Just a word about DNA ploidy in leukemias. This is also very, very important, especially with the kind of dyes which are now available. There is a dye called FX cycle dye, which has been used extensively in our country as well now. And in fact, one of my colleagues has worked on this. This is the slides from him, wherein you have used a dye called FX cycle. You removed the doublets from estimation and then looked at the lymphocytes. You gated your lymphocytes over here and looked at what is the expression of FX cycle on them. The gating, when you do the gating, you are able to figure out the diploid cells on the lymphocyte region, and then subsequently you get the blasts. Once you've gated the blasts and you're trying to figure out how they pan out vis-a-vis lymphocytes, you're able to figure out your blasts versus your lymphocytes. And in this particular case, they were relatively hyperdiploid, which I'm showing you as an example. Of course, it's also been shown that when you look at various types of DNA index which you get from the flow cytometry, it very clearly gives you the chromosome number also on cytogenetic studies subsequently. So therefore, doing a DNA ploidy on flow cytometry using FX cycle methodology is a useful methodology. This work has been published by my colleague, Dr. Nishit Gupta, in Clinical Cytometry in 2019, and has been acknowledged as a very good methodology of looking at chromosomal numbers. Just to show you one odd case here and there. So various types of leukemias which we have seen in our practice, you have these blasts which are haploid, the diploid blasts which are overlapping with the lymphocytes here, low hyperdiploid, the red ones which you're seeing on the right hand side, of course the high hyperdiploid, near tetraploid, and low haploid, hypodiploid, as well as near diploid blast, which we saw in one of the cases. So clearly flow cytometry is able to give you very distinct distinction between various types of DNA ploidies of the leukemic cells in patients. Again, during MRD, we can also use DNA ploidy to differentiate between various subtypes. Sometimes you may not be able to pick up using the usual MRD methodologies, but on flow cytometry, you are able to pick them up separately and distinctly differentiate between various cell types. For example, in this particular case, you were able to pick up your MRD because you were able to see this particular peak subsequently on the MRD analysis. So it is here to stay, and DNA ploidy studies become an important aspect for people to look at. There is also, remember, you can use this DNA ploidy studies to pick up blasts when you're looking at relapses which are other than the relapses coming from the usual marrow or the peripheral blood. Like in this particular case, in our case, we were able to pick it up from the testicular biopsy and in the testicular FNAC, sorry, and in that FNAC, we were able to pick up our blast very clearly by using DNA ploidy studies, subsequently confirmed by the biopsy as well. All right, last but not the least, we also look at the PNH by flow cytometry, and PNH, even though may not be considered as a leukemia, but for all practical purposes can become a nightmare for a lot of us. Of course, PNH is done by using the FLAIR nowadays, which is the high resolution flow cytometry, that's what we call it. And you use it against a CD24, you're clearly and distinctly able to get this population, which is the granulocytic population devoid of both FLAIR and CD24. And again, a monocytic population, which you have identified over here, devoid of FLAIR as well as CD14. So this clearly gives you a clone of PNH in such patients. And you can eventually do it on a flow cytometry using the CD59 marker for the red cells as well. What you're able to see in this case, this is your negative control, which you're seeing over here. And in such patients, in normal patients, you're not able to see the other populations of cells, where in a typical PNH, you're able to see distinctly 3 populations, which I'm showing you over here. Now, with that, I come to the end of my topic. And just to give you a take-home message, flow cytometry today is an invaluable technology in the examination of blood, bone marrow, tissue, body fluids for the presence or absence of hematological disease. And I have specifically used the term hematological disease because it's not only useful in malignancies, but in non-malignant disorders as well. It is used both in diagnostic as well as follow-up testing. And in fact, it's found a very important role today in identifying and defining the minimal residual disease detection. One very important caveat which most of us need to remember is that it's highly dependent upon the operator. So if the person does not have an appropriate training and interpretational skills, you can get into a lot of trouble, and you may be getting misdiagnosis as well. And this is becoming more prevalent now because most of us have now moved on to 8 color and 10 color equipment, and therefore need to make sure that the people handling the machines are also trained on and are having appropriate interpretative skills. So with that, I come to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are.
So thank you very much, Dr. Handu. I think it was a marathon talk you did. You have been speaking nonstop for the last almost 1 hour, 15 minutes. There are a few questions. I think I'll just kind of compile a couple of them, summarize a couple of them. I think it's a very common question. You briefly touched it also in your talk. That is mPHAL/biphenotypic. Are they same or are they different? Number one. And number two, I think you alluded also, there's little, recent change in the way we, label them as mPHAL. So what is that change and how is it different from the previous EAGLE score? So that is the first question.
Okay. So if we look at biphenotypic leukemias, previously the EAGLE scoring was pretty simple. It would, give a score to a particular marker. The ones which were very specific, lineage specific markers, you will get a score of 2. One which were lineage associated markers, you would get a score of 1. And the markers which were just supportive, you would give a score of 0.5. And then basis that, you would say if the score is more than 2.5, you would classify it as the leukemia positive for that particular lineage. And if it was less than 2.5, you will consider it as negative for that particular lineage. Of course, there was a lot of overlap at that point of time. So I don't think we have made it any which way better. This is my personal opinion. I think we have made it a bit more complex because now we are also agreeing to the fact that when we have patients, who have the expression of, say, Philadelphia chromosome in them or presence of MLL gene, irrespective of whatever they are, we still would like to put them in the classification of MPAL, especially if they're having coexistent other myeloid markers, in them. Now, if we go across to the current classification of biphenotypic or MPALs, which have been classified now, we need to keep in mind that we are looking at expression of markers vis-a-vis various, lineages. So for myeloid lineage, we need to acknowledge the fact that we do not only consider immunophenotypic MPO, we will need to consider the cytochemical MPO as well, and sometimes immunohistochemical MPO also might need to be done on a refined biopsy. Now, this is important because whenever we are dealing with a case wherever we have not had any MPO expression, to call it a myeloid, to give it a myeloid lineage or myeloid connotation can at times become problematic. This is especially seen when you're dealing with cases like, TALLs, because a lot of TALLs actually express myeloid markers. And unfortunately, I have seen in my practice also for the last now 15 years, wrong classification because people did not want to acknowledge the fact that the MPO was actually negative and they wanted to call it positive. So therefore, important distinction between TALLs and MPALs is important. And WHO is the only current methodology by which we can follow it. And of course, in all these cases, doing proper molecular testing is very, very important. I hope that answers your question, Sunil.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's a continuation of the question that was aberrancy, so what's the aberrant expression? And,
Okay.
Where do you draw that line of aberrancy and no aberrancy?
Okay, so see the simplest way of looking at something as an aberrant is, which is not normally expressed in that particular cell. Let me give you an example. In a normal myeloid cell, you will not have expression of CD7. That's a normal thing. It's not expressed there. But if you look at acute myeloid leukemia, especially the M0s and the M1s, the expression of CD7 is kind of almost near normal. It almost happens in almost all cases of M7 that M1 that you find a aberrant expression of CD7 because this is not a lineage marker coming from the myeloid lineage. It's coming from a T lineage which is coming there. Similarly, presence of, say, for instance, a CD15 as a marker in BALLs. Again, 15 is a marker which is seen on granulocytic series and should not be ideally found in cases of the BALLs. And therefore, presence of CD15 in a BALL is a presence of an aberrant marker. The biggest challenge which you face with respect to aberrant markers is when you're dealing with cases like ETP-ALL, classifying ETP-ALL versus, other ALLs or versus a biphenotypic leukemia having myeloid and T lineage expression. That's where the biggest challenge will come because you have 13, 33 expression, you have 10 expression, and all these are also expressed in cases of BALLs, and as well as in cases of myeloid leukemias. So therefore, in such circumstances, these aberrant expression markers become important. However, one needs to be keeping one very important aspect in mind is that you need to look at CD3, you need to look at myeloperoxidase, and you need to look at specific B cell antigen, which is 19, 22, and 79A. If we are ensuring that we have taken care of the lineage specific markers, then we will be able to classify it appropriately. I'm sure that, despite all that, there can be one odd case in between, which always gives problems to everybody, even to the best of the experts in this field. And well, that is one aberrant kind of a case which might be there, but overall aberrant markers actually help you a lot, especially when you're dealing with minimal residual disease detection later on.
Dr. Hunter, do you have a few more minutes? Because there are 2 or 3
Yes, of
more
course.
questions in the chat box.
No worries. We can go
Okay,
ahead.
so first is, I think it's in the, asked in the context of ALL, but I'll probably, rephrase this question. That is when we do post-induction marrows, you see blast, but MRD is negative. It's in, I think it's asked the question of ALLs, but I think it's more relevant in AMLs. And in continuation to that question is that, how reliable, is there still a role of morphology in post-induction marrow in AML?
So as
2
far as
questions in one, yeah.
Yeah, so as far as AML post-induction marrows are concerned, the presence of blasts will happen, because we are looking at a regenerative marrow. The biggest challenge that you have in acute myeloid leukemia minimal residual disease detection today in the best of the centers in the world and even in our own country is to differentiate normal regenerating myeloid blasts versus the leukemic myeloid blasts. And that potentially has a huge issue. But there are certain markers which are used specifically, even at diagnosis and subsequently at the time of regeneration. That's like day 29, day 33, or whatever marrows you've done, post-induction marrows, and you are able to pick them separately as well. I showed you a few slides on DNA ploidy. In fact, that's come out to be a very promising methodology of picking up these abnormal blasts. But there can always be a counter question that, do you have abnormal ploidies in all the blasts? No, sorry, you don't. You have only about 50-55% cases where you have abnormal ploidy. But when you're trying to look at all these markers together, you look at ploidy, you look at the other markers, and then try to correlate with all of them. I was giving you an example of CD7. Now, in normal regenerative blasts, also you can have CD7 expression. And that becomes a big challenge when you're doing MRD analysis on flow cytometry at the time of minimal residual disease detection in AML. It's also important to realize that when we are doing minimal residual disease detection for ALL, even there you can have a morphological versus a phenotypic, correlation, discordance between them. The reason is because in the morphology, you're picking up anything which is looking like blast as a blast. But subsequently, when you actually do phenotyping, you figure out that they were not really blasts. They might have been hematogones. There's also another important thing which we have observed, and we have also published it recently, and that's there is a system where people are getting GCSF therapy, during the course of treatment. GCSF itself also pushes the blasts, at least morphologically, you are able to pick them as blasts very clearly. And subsequently, we have also seen that times that in the morphology and even in phenotype later on, you find them very distinctly that they're blasts, but these are myeloid blasts, and you are able to differentiate them. So that's why I said, in my conclusive slide also, I said very clearly, appropriate training and appropriate, man behind the machine is extremely important in this particular technology, because you need the person, who's knowing this very well, who's had experience in this area, trained appropriately to decipher as to what we're dealing with.
Thank you very much. And, the other question is, what is the minimum blast count you want in a peripheral blood to be able to, make interpretations on a flow, which a peripheral blood is sent, not the marrow? That's one. And the continuation question also is, which has been posed here, is events. When we talk about events, what events means, and I think I can extend it further that, how many events you require in MRD setting and in non-MRD settings.
Okay. That's a very, very good question. Many a times what happens is you've done a marrow and you thought that you will do a marrow and get a, flow done on that eventually. But when you did a marrow, you found that it's a dry tap. You didn't get material from the marrow at all. And all you have is maybe 1 or 2 blasts which are present in the peripheral blood. Can I still go ahead and do a flow cytometry on blood and give you the diagnosis with respect to what blasts are we dealing with? The answer to that question is absolutely yes. What we need to do is, this is again something which we need to learn over a period of time. Most of us are not kind of trained to understand that many a times the sample might not be easily available, and therefore whatever we have available is in the blood, and we need to actually make a buffy coat out of it. So as a practice, what do we do in our center is we take more sample of the peripheral blood. Instead of 1, we might take 2 or sometimes even 3 tubes. We'll combine all of them together. We'll make a buffy coat out of it, and then use a buffy coat sample as a primary sample of estimating, looking at the blast phenotype. Mind you, we are only trying to look at the phenotype of the blast, and here the quantity will not matter at all, because quantity anyways is going to be picked up from the bone marrow. So,
so that was irrespective of the blast percentage, what you meant, right?
Absolutely.
So it doesn't really matter. If you have blast in the peripheral blood, you'll be able to
absolutely.
at least characterize them. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's possible to be characterized. And in fact, it is on the same premise that you are able to do flow cytometry on CSF also. Sometimes you have just maybe 1 blast which you're seeing on a cytospin on a CSF, but you want to figure out, is this a blast or is this a lymphocyte? So even in such cases, the methodology is pretty simple. You will have to manipulate the sample. You will have to centrifuge the sample, get the buffy coat kind of a thing, even in CSF, and then put that up for flow cytometry. And fortunately, for the last almost now 4 years, we've been doing this practice, and we've been getting good results, consistently good results with that. I forgot the other part of the question which you asked.
Events.
Okay, coming to the second part, which is about events. Remember, whenever you're trying to find something, which is very low in number, like MRD, the number of events means the number of cells which have to pass through the laser. So when I'm trying to figure out, say, one cell in 10,000 cells, obviously I will need to acquire minimum those 10,000 events to pick up that one cell. But that one cell is not sufficient for me statistically, because statistically that one event may be just a stray event. So therefore, whenever I'm doing analysis, which is on rare event analysis or MRD analysis, the number of events is determined on a live gate. And when I'm saying live gate, I'm talking about the area of interest or the cell of interest. So what I would like to have, and what is internationally acceptable for minimal residual disease, is that at least I should have 50 events in the specified gate that I'm trying to target, and in that case, the MRD gate. As far as diagnostic flow cytometry is concerned, so internationally also, and it is a proper consensus which is available from the flow cytometry circles, it says that in diagnostic flow cytometry, as long as you are able to identify a cell cluster which is more than, say, 50-60 cells, it's good enough to acquire the number of events accordingly to that. So as a usual ballpark, when I started my career, Sunil, way back in Gangaram in 2002, the norm which we had adopted at that point of time was just to acquire 10,000 cells, 10,000 events, what we call them. But over a period of years, what we realized is that 10,000 events may not be sufficient. Sometimes, your other cells, like the ones which I was talking about, bilineal leukemias, sometimes the small clone might be just missed by acquiring only those 10,000 events. So as a norm, majority of the centers into good flow cytometry practices are usually taking minimum 30,000 events for diagnostic flow cytometry. And for minimal residual disease detection, unless you have any compulsions of not acquiring the entire tube, we prefer to acquire the entire tube, because that gives us depth of detection to a much higher level. So therefore, for MRD or stray event analysis, acquire the full tube. Whereas for diagnostic flow cytometry, what I would prefer is to do at least minimum 30,000 events. And I hope event has been understood. Event is nothing but a particle which is flowing across the laser, the interrogation point, which I said in my first few slides. So which is equivalent to a cell, in other words.
So for MRD, what you said is full tube. So that is of course maximum, but minimum would be 50,000 or?
So no, for a leukemia, yes, a preferable thing is 1 million. I would definitely want 1 million events to come in, because that would make it very, very robust and would make it sure that whatever I'm calling MRD is truly MRD. Otherwise, with lesser number of events, the chances are that if I have a proper disease, yes, fine, it might come out to be right. But many a times, if the disease is so minimal, I might actually give wrong interpretations.
So, Dr. Anil, before you conclude, I think the concept of color, when you talk about color in flow cytometry, 5 color, 6 color, 8 color, 10 color, is still kind of little not understood. So just briefly, if you could just, just briefly say what you exactly meant by color.
So the point is, when we are talking about color, the idea is, in a simpler language, if I tell you, it is like the number of antigens which you can parallelly find out from that particular tube. Now, for instance, if my flow cytometer has one photodiode and two photomultiplier tubes for detection of the fluorochrome, then my instrument is two color, because it has only two fluorochromes which can be identified. Similarly, if I have 4 fluorochromes which I can identify at the same time, then it's a 4 color. If it is 6 fluorochromes, then it is 6 color. Now, from a clinical standpoint, the color is equivalent to the number of antigens. So if I combine the antibody with a fluorochrome, that is the antibody that it will pick up. So practically speaking, more the colors in a single tube, the better it is for you, because then you can look at concomitant expressions on a single cell. And that's what makes it advantageous when you are doing more than, say, 6 color or 8 color or 10 color flow cytometry. It makes it advantageous. But at the same time, we also need to remember, the more the number of colors, more the complexity, because light unfortunately does not flow in a fixed manner. It has a tendency to overlap on each other. So once the light falls from one area to another, you may have complexities and you may misinterpret. That's why it is important to make sure that the person who's handling it, is aware of all this. which happens most of the times in majority of the laboratories. Most of the people have been well trained now. We're not talking about 2002, we are in 2020 now. And a lot of people have been trained across the country, and a lot of people have been trained abroad, and they have come back and, have set up very beautiful laboratories. And most of the people who are really doing flow cytometry properly in the country are actually following and adhering to these norms.
Now, last question, Dr. Handu, we're very greedy. So last question, Neeta has in fact asked this, and that is, I think, a very important question. That is interlab. So we have done a diagnostic flow at different lab, then you're getting an MRD at different lab. I think I will probably again, probably add a little bit more to that, and that is both in the context of ALL, AML, and TALL. How would that matter, where the diagnostic flow has been run and the MRD has been run, at a different lab. So how do we tackle that, and anything specific we need to remember?
So if I look at MRD in general, let's not talk about BA, BET, AML, etc. When we do MRD analysis on a leukemic sample, whichever sample it may be, it's important for us to remember that ideal situation would be that I should have run the same panel at diagnosis as well. That makes it 100% robust when you are interpreting, the MRD sample also. So that means in other words, what I'm trying to say is that at my diagnosis, I have used the same set of tubes with the same set of antibodies. And subsequently, at the time of MRD analysis, also, I'm using again the same set of tubes with the same set of antibodies. Now, this is luxury because this does not happen in every center, because again, MRD has its own issues, and a lot of people have not really, reached to a stage where they will use diagnostic flow cytometry and MRD flow cytometry in conjunction. So what's the best media or best modality? First thing, as far as diagnostic flow cytometry is concerned, even though I'm making a statement the way I'm making it, it is relatively easy to do diagnostic flow cytometry. Comparatively, when you do minimal residual disease detection flow cytometry, it's relatively more complex. So this is the first thing we need to understand. Therefore, what am I trying to say? MRD should be done by people who are appropriately trained in MRD. That's number one. Number two, MRD panels can be different from the diagnostic panels, and that's not a big problem because fortunately the way the MRD panels have been developed now across the globe have ensured that despite you using a different panel at diagnosis, in MRD at the time of MRD, the different panel will still be able to give you the presence of minimal residual disease, and that can potentially be reported very nicely and correctly. So again, coming back to the discussion, ideal thing would be to run the MRD tubes parallelly even at diagnosis. But even if you've not done that, it will not mean the end of the world. In the right perspective, in the right people setting, in the right laboratory, doing an MRD analysis on flow cytometry with the different panels subsequently may not be out of place, and it will work equally well.
And that will work well for all the three types which I just mentioned?
So B and T, fortunately, BALL, TALL, fortunately now has been standardized perfectly. In fact, in majority of the laboratories across the country, I would vouch for most of them because the interlaboratory comparisons have also happened pretty significantly. In Delhi also, we run an interlaboratory comparison program, which has about 19 laboratories participating. And fortunately, all of them have performed very well with respect to B and TALL MRD. The challenge starts coming in the moment you get into AML MRD and myeloma and CLPD and other MRDs, because in such areas, number one, the learning is still going on. I don't think any one of us can say with, including me and including many others from Tata as well, can say to the emphasis that, look, I am an expert in this area, because AML MRD is still evolving and we all need to accept that. So therefore, there is a challenge in AML MRD still. I agree with you completely if you think on those lines. And even in myeloma MRD and CLPD and other chronic lymphoproliferative disorder MRD, it is still a bit of a challenge. But when you look at B and TALL MRD, I think we're kind of sorted in our country now.
Thank you very much. That was it in the chat from the chat box. So I think we have taken a lot of your time. I'm pretty sure there'll be many more questions. Any burning questions anyone has? No, I think that's it. So thank you very much, Dr. Handu. I think from the PHO chapter, we all appreciate your time and your contribution today. It's been a wonderful session. I think it's helped all of us as I said earlier, the students especially who are going to be in the exams as well, in the next few weeks is going to be a real, refresher for them. And you have covered the length and breadth of it in a very simple language and in a very, easy to understand, in an understandable way. So we appreciate and thank you very much for joining us today. And again, thanks to Neeta and Anand for, coordinating these sessions. Ria for being the backbone, the IT backbone, and also Echo for the platform. So we'll see you soon, Dr. Andu, sometime physically.
Sure.
So,
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thanks for
thank you
calling me
for
on
your
board.
time.
Thank you for calling me on board, and thank you everyone for joining in. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good evening, everyone.